Good afternoon to you. Mark Sutter, HurricaneTrack.com here with your off-season edition of the Hurricane Outlook and discussion for Tuesday, February 11th, 2020. Hope your week is going well. Today we're going to talk about, in the weekly discussion, the current state of the ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation phenomenon. Generally speaking, that is the single biggest puzzle piece that we look at in terms of what may direct the upcoming hurricane season, both for the Pacific, but more importantly perhaps for the Atlantic, because as you probably know by now, an El Nino in the Pacific, the abnormal warming of the equatorial Pacific, typically means the Atlantic hurricane season is less active. And when we have neutral to La Nina conditions, either neutral, obviously that means it's neither warm nor cold, it's neutral, or La Nina, which is the cooling abnormally of the Pacific region, the tropical Pacific. La Nina tends to favor more activity, but if you go and look through history, it's those neutral years where we seem to get the most hits on the United States. By just a slim margin, but it is true. So we're going to look at the state of the ENSO, and then other features related to that, sea surface temperature anomalies, so forth and so on, and then a little bit of lower 48 weather. All right? So let's first go down under to Australia. Been in the news a lot because of the brush fires and the drought, etc. But they do have this great historical database that they rely upon, going back many hundreds of years to when Aborigines were the only ones there. And this goes to show you that weather, obviously, being an important factor in more than just our everyday lives, it has the benefit of giving us a look back in time. And so what I'm getting at is the Australian government, the Bureau of Meteorology, they know what they're talking about. And this stuff's really important because it drives their climate. And, literally for several hundred years or more, that has been something that Australians have kept up with, and so these records are very useful. And ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation phenomenon, is a big driver with that. And that's what they talk about right here, the current state of the Pacific and Indian Oceans, because that's where Australia is located, down in the southern part of those areas. And the way those oceans behave with the warmth, whether it's abnormal or normal or below normal, really has a lot to do in shaping the future of Australia's weather. Does that make sense? So the overview, to get back at the topic at hand, and it really just goes to show you how teleconnections, everything around the globe is connected. In the world of weather, it definitely is. So right now, the headline, the tropical Pacific Ocean remains ENSO neutral. That the atmospheric and oceanic indicators of ENSO remain neutral, and that includes the SOI, the Southern Oscillation Index, cloudiness near the date line, the trade winds, the subsurface temperatures, all these ways that they kind of measure this. It's kind of like if you went in to the doctor for an annual checkup, and they take your blood pressure, they take your blood, a urinalysis, and they check on different enzymes and levels of different things, and you get a report. What is the state of you or me, right? And that's what we look at here. The state of the ENSO has these different facets, these different ways that it gets examined, and part of that is the subsurface, trade winds, SOI. In other words, it's not just one thing. You wouldn't go to the doctor. I know we would all love to do this, because who wants to get sick and have some kind of a chronic illness, right? I get that. But you don't get to go to the doctor and say, oh, I feel great. I'm feeling fine. And, oh, okay, well, you must be feeling fine. There's not just one indicator. You may look fine and you may feel fine, and that's what you present. But maybe your blood work says something different. That's what this is all about, looking beneath the surface, subsurface temperature anomalies, trade winds, all kinds of different ways that ENSO is tracked. That's what this is talking about. So those different parameters indicating ENSO neutral right now. And a few other things I want to point out. The outlooks going forward. This is the Australian. I wonder if they still call it the POAMA. P-O-A-M-A. Right down here, what does it say? Just says Commonwealth of Australia. I remember they used to call one of these the Poama model, but whatever. This is, I guess, one from Australia here, and it shows over the next several months getting closer to neutral, which is this line right through here, but definitely in neutral territory. And I say neutral, I mean zero, like dead neutral. And then the different model ensembles in the gray there, the different members. You can also look up here at climate models and get a breakdown. This is another graphical way, and the ensemble, or the mean, I guess, of all these different models for February. And then you can look at March, what do they look like? April, what do they look like? May, so forth and so on. And the overall mean right there, this is so important. There you go. Draw an arrow to it. You know, real close to zero, but definitely in the white, which is neutral, but real close to zero. This is just a different way of visualizing this. So the NASA model, of course, this one here, really going crazy with La Nina by June. Don't think that's going to happen, but whatever. We're all entitled to our opinions, I guess. And then there are, of course, the breakdown of the various models as an example. This is the CFS. Whoops, I didn't mean to click on that one. I want to click on that one. Here is the latest CFS. This is run pretty much every day. And the climate forecast system, that's what CFS means, version 2. For the Nino 3.4 area, it's a certain region of the tropical Pacific. You know, down she goes. And the blues in here, these blue colors of these plots, are the most recent members, the most recent 8 forecast members. And, you know, some of them are not as aggressive, some of them are more aggressive. You can look at the black dash line, that's your mean there, your average. And it's pretty, you know, telling that it's trying to develop a La Nina by the time we get to the peak of the hurricane season in this time period between July and October. All right, so we will be watching all of these things very closely, but still no indications that we're going to have an El Nino in place. And that, my friends, is very important. The absence of El Nino usually means the Atlantic hurricane season is at least average, and usually above average when you have an absence of El Nino, and especially with intense hurricanes. But we'll worry about that more down the road a piece. Maybe April and May, when we get more data, more insight from folks like Phil Klotzbach and his outlook that will be released at the National Tropical Weather Conference in South Padre Island in Texas. But here's another way to look at it all, the SOI, the Southern Oscillation Index. Typically when these numbers are strongly negative, that's El Nino, usually -7 and below. Strongly positive, +7 and higher is La Nina. And all of the numbers, as you can see, everything's generally on the upswing here, headed towards that all-important 0 right there, so that everything just kind of zeroes out. It's all neutral. And I think that's where we're headed. That generally speaking, it kind of peaked in November with -9. December, we came up a little bit, a big jump from December to January. And we'll see where we end up for February. But all in all, indications are that as we get to the anomaly map, the actual surface temperature anomalies, anomaly means departure from an average or a normal, if you want to call it normal, whatever. I just don't see that we're going to have a big warm area out through here come hurricane season. And right now, there's a few splotches, warmer than average, cooler than average, warmer than average, but nothing exceedingly so. There's nothing that's really tipping the scale heavily in favor of warmer or colder at the moment. Not at the surface anyway. And then a very large area, as I've pointed out, of colder anomalies in the North Pacific this year, South Pacific as well. And when you compare this, again, I really want to draw your attention to this big old negative sign in the Pacific, positive sign in the Atlantic. Because, I mean, come on, I'm not making this up. Warm, cold, right, relative to average. And you can see that as well as I can. That the data that's updated on the 10th of this month, right, just yesterday, all of the North Atlantic here, generally speaking, warmer than average and more so in some places than others, but it is warmer than the Pacific is. So I guess you would say that it is tipped in favor of the Atlantic right now, but it's only February. let's wait and see what happens by August. But right now, draw some eyeballs here as they show, that little emoji or whatever, it's got the eyes that are looking like, whoa, that's terrible. But I'm watching because this is interesting. We'll just put it that way. Another way we can look at all this, graphically, this is the Caribbean sea surface temperature anomaly. Just to give you an idea, this is plotted graphically on a graph. So you can look at a map. This is what we call a thematic map. It shows something. It has a theme, and in this case, it's anomalies of sea surface temperatures. And then you can look at this in graphical format, visualization. This, of course, from Levi Cowan's website, tropicaltidbits.com. And the Caribbean value is about 0.6 of a degree Celsius above the long-term average. And I'm just going to reiterate something that I've talked about before. Let's say that you had one of those smart showers, I guess, a smart bathroom where you can come in and you can say, hey Google, or hey Alexa, or whatever. Hey bathroom, you turn the shower on and you come in and you say, turn the water up 0.626 degrees Celsius. Assuming that it could do that, right? And it could be that precise. And we're just pretending here. And you're in the shower and it's just streaming over you and you're like, oh, this feels good. And you go, all right, shower, turn the water up 0.626 Celsius. Would you notice a difference? Maybe, if you're really sensitive to that. But more than likely, you really wouldn't notice a big difference. But when we're talking about the relative vast expanse of an area like the Caribbean Sea here, that the average temperature across here is 0.6 of a degree Celsius above the long-term norm, that is a tremendous amount of extra heat. Heat here, that's the key. Heat energy where? Trapped in the Caribbean, trapped in that water there. I say trapped, that sounds negative. It is stored. That's the better way to put it. It is untapped, stored energy, and as the graph shows, it is running above the long-term average by 0.6 degrees Celsius. And so that's a lot more energy available down the road. So this has been pretty steady, as you can see, for the last several months. Just a couple of anomalies that jumped up here. Otherwise, if you smooth it out, it's been fairly steady, consistently above 0.5 degree Celsius above the long-term average. Will that make a difference this hurricane season? Maybe. You have to have hurricanes to come along. And there's other factors that can make this interesting and important. But right now, I think the biggest takeaway here, these numbers, none of them are below the zero. They're all on the positive side. No negative anomalies in the Caribbean. If we look at the Atlantic Main Development Region, where is that? Just to kind of refresh your memory. Generally speaking, we're talking about this area right through here. That too, running above average overall. Not too much. It's only about, we'll just round it up and call it 1/3 of a degree Celsius. Nevertheless, that's more energy. And you can see it's consistently been, except for this one blip here, above the average here since November. And, almost 0.5 degree Celsius back towards the end of 2019. And then this weird dip here. But then 2020 started warming, kind of losing it a little bit with stronger trade winds, a very strong North Atlantic oscillation, strong high pressure. So this may come down a bit and then go back up towards spring. And we'll wait and see. Bottom line again, folks, positive. It's positive. And then the Nino 3-4 index, which is way out here in the tropical Pacific, generally speaking, something like that, roughly. This area right through here, cooling overall, and we can see that general, gentle slope right down to about 0.25 degree Celsius above the long-term average. And these are big keys. These are stuff that we will look at, these keys to the game, if you will, as we approach hurricane season. And once we get to March 1st, of course, we're talking about 90 days away. That's all. I want to point this out. I thought this was really neat. I show the Vorticity Maps during the hurricane season. We talk about tropical cyclones bundling that energy, and we look for these roundish blobs of energy, if you will, or vorticity, spin in the atmosphere down in the deep tropics. Let's change this color to white. We'll try to watch down here across this area. Notice in February the void of any colors down there. All the energy and the storminess is up here in the northern latitudes. And I just wanted to point this out. I think this is fascinating. So storminess, big storm up here in the North Atlantic, some storminess in the desert southwest. Energy vorticity is all up here in the northern latitudes. Very little in the way of tropical wave activity and related weather phenomenon down in the tropics. So generally speaking, the off season, just a few little impulses moving through here. None of these very significant. And you'll see that this changes as we go through the next few months. I'll show this again in March. And I'm going to save this image, and we'll start to compare these. March 10th, April 10th, May 10th. Watch what happens. The energy starts to shift from the northern latitudes to the southern latitudes, and we start to get these tropical waves become more vigorous as we get closer to hurricane season, and you start to concentrate that energy out of the mid-latitudes and the higher latitudes, up here, the subtropics. This will dissipate. This will become more energized. I just think that's neat. It's just basic meteorology and seasonal variability, etc. Something fascinating, at least I think it is. Hopefully you do too. The weather map today, pretty active. State of New Mexico as an example here. Whoops, can't see that. There we go. Draw on top of that. Winter storm warnings, some winter weather advisories for the Panhandle, flooding in parts of the Deep South and up here through parts of Ohio, River Valley and vicinity, Kentucky, West Virginia, Southern Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Tennessee. I mean, it's just a mess. And the reason is we have a fairly potent and solid southeast ridge of high pressure, thick dome of air. Cold air coming out of Canada is bumping up against that, basically bouncing off. This is not budging, and we're not getting any major Arctic intrusions. This is your battleground area, your zone, if you will, of fighting air masses, and voila, you have a lot of flooding. And it really has been a problem. If you've been paying attention to social media, you've seen this, and we can look at it on the rivers, lakes, and rainfall off the weather.gov homepage. And as an example, there's the national map. Lots of reds and oranges in there indicating minor to moderate flooding. But if we look at just at Alabama, zoom into Alabama here for just a moment as this populates. Lots and lots of these areas now in oranges, some of these in red in Mississippi. And you can see the flood gauges there headed towards moderate flooding. All of this region here soaked with storm system after storm system, and that is going to continue. And a lot of these rivers, of course, flow towards the Gulf of Mexico. Some of them feed into tributaries that will end up eventually towards maybe the Mississippi River, larger rivers in the southeast, creeks, streams, you name it, these watersheds as they're called. This is going to be a big problem going forward. And we need to pay attention to this as we get into spring, because all of this very warm water that's lurking in the Gulf, yes, generally speaking warmer than average, the warm Caribbean, the strong high pressure of the western Atlantic is just going to pump very moist air into the southeast, and we will probably have a pretty stout severe weather season in the Great Plains, maybe over here in the traditional Tornado Alley area, as well as parts of the Deep South. Wouldn't surprise me if it's an active tornado season once we get into especially April and May. And speaking of tornado season, I was talking to one of our supporters and good friend and colleague of mine and ours, friend of HurricaneTrack. His name is Brent. You know him from the 2018 documentary, The Tracking the Hurricanes. He was there with me for Florence and Michael. Brent is one of our patrons on Patreon. He's also an active participant. He doesn't just fund what we do, he's got hands-on. And he was chatting with me a couple nights ago, I guess now, and you can tell I'm excited. I'm getting out of breath. We are going to go to Tornado Alley in May and test the weather balloon, our Hurby, H-U-R-R-B project, on the backdrop, using the backdrop of a severe weather outbreak. I was also talking with our good friend and colleague Greg Nordstrom. I'm wearing the Mississippi State Severe Weather Symposium t-shirt today. I know Greg from Mississippi State. He is a professor there, and they have, of course, a great broadcast meteorology program, severe weather experts there. They've won numerous competitions in forecasting, dominated that for several years in a row. And while this is not officially with the university, Greg's going to be on the plains with some of his colleagues. He and I will be working together with Brent. Bottom line, we are going to do something incredibly exciting in Tornado Alley in the month of May. We don't have a specific time frame yet. Oh, we're going to go out from the 9th through the 15th. We're going to wait, and when we see the severe weather threat present itself for a multi-day outbreak, specifically a dry line event, not necessarily going tornado chasing, that's not what we want to do. We want to launch the weather balloon for testing purposes using the backdrop of a severe weather outbreak, mainly along a dry line event, and gather some data while we're testing our weather balloon that we will use in a hurricane, in the eye of a hurricane. Won't that be incredible? It sure will. And at the same time, we're going to set up a network, probably a half a dozen, of our unmanned camera systems just ahead of this the forecast dry line area. And if you know severe weather, you know what I'm talking about. And if you don't, we'll talk about it later. It's just going to be incredible. We're going to be able to have live footage, live feeds, pressure data from our weather sensors, these pressure sensors we have in each of the camera boxes, and then as well as, of course, the weather balloon to launch as the dry line erupts, put the balloon up, capture that dry line erupting from the stratosphere, looking down, gather the vertical profile data like a sounding through the atmosphere to the stratosphere, and then have these 6 camera systems monitoring it like sentries, you know, like a sentry, like somebody that stands guard along the ground over maybe 200 or 300 miles. Are you kidding me? This is going to be incredible. And it'll be a really, really good opportunity to kind of warm up, get ready for the hurricane season, look at it as our spring training. Literally. Baseball, they do spring training down in Florida and in Arizona. Maybe they do it in Texas as well. We're going to do our spring training somewhere in the Great Plains in May. So I look forward to that. We'll talk about that more in the future. But we just spoke about this, me and my colleagues and I the other night, whatever. I like to be grammatically correct. We just spoke about it together, and we're very excited about it. So we'll talk about that more going in the future. All right? So there you go. That's a look at things, this off-season hurricane outlook and discussion for you for this week. The week of February 10th, even though today's the 11th. You know what I'm saying. As always, I appreciate you tuning in. Remember, I am on Twitter at HurricaneTrack. We are crowdfunded through Patreon, and you can go to patreon.com/HurricaneTrack or click the link in the description of today's video to learn more about that and the exciting things we're doing on Patreon, including our podcast series. All of our original programming is on Patreon, including all of our documentaries. It's kind of like Amazon Prime, where it's included with Prime, or a Netflix subscription, right? Think of it as Netflix for weather geeks with all of this stuff, too. That's what we do on Patreon, so check that out if you get a chance, all right? Hey, thanks for tuning in. I do appreciate it as always. I am Mark Sudduth for HurricaneTrack.com. I'll be back with more for you next week.